Great, so our next presenter is Clara Lindstrom. Clara is currently a doctoral student at CIS in East-West psychology, where her focus is the intersection of spirit and matter, issues of social and environmental justice, and community building and storytelling as paths to healing. Outside of academic study, Clara works with scholars, teachers, and activists to create content for CIS public programs and performances. And her talk today is titled Love of Wild Places, an intergenerational story of cultural coding for the Ecozoic era. Let's welcome Clara.
Okay, so my talk has changed a little bit from when I first signed up for the conference, so just roll with it. That was so many months ago. Okay, and pardon me if I speak fast. I'm trying to squish a lot in. I really want to get to the end. So let me start out simply by defining love as the stuff that holds the universe together and that furthers evolution. Teilhard de Chardin talks about love as a force so powerful and pervasive, it is responsible for drawing together the very atoms of the universe into ever more solid and complexified centers of matter. He calls this process amorization, the root being amour, or love. And this process of amorization brings together not only atoms and particles, but also, fantastically, human beings. You could say it's what brought us together today, because what else but the pull of love would cause perfectly irrational human beings to forego a gorgeous spring weekend outside in favor of sitting inside at a conference?
Yeah.
All of this to say that what I'm about to present is grounded in this particular understanding of love. I'm going to tell you a story, as I love to do, and everything from the experience it describes to the astonishing and still unfolding repercussions it has had is underpinned by this cosmological force. You yourself, as part of the PCC or larger CIIS community, play a major role in this story. For Teilhard asserts that the direction evolution is taking us is toward a greater, more complexified, shared consciousness. Physically and biologically, he says, the human being, like everything else in nature, is essentially plural, a mass phenomenon. This means that we cannot reach our own ultimate without uniting ourselves with others, to develop through this union an added measure of consciousness, hence the deep surge of love, which drives us to associate our individual center with other centers. Love, whose essential function and charm are that it completes us. Community, which is the physical expression and outcome of the process that Teilhard is describing, thus figures prominently in the direction we are inevitably headed. While each of us has his or her own unique destiny, we are at the same time totally and gloriously dependent on each other. So, what is the story I'm about to tell? Well, it's actually a story within a story. Now, stay with me. A few months ago, I had the good fortune to take a class on Thomas Berry and Teilhard de Chardin with Drs. Swim and McDermott. Some of you were there. As many of you are aware, the work of Teilhard and Thomas dovetails nicely with respect to the natural world, humankind's embeddedness in it, and the critical role that we play as a species in the coevolution of matter and consciousness. As self-described geologian, Thomas Berry has said, the natural world is not simply object, not simply a usable thing, not an inert mode of being. The natural world is subject as well as object. The natural world is the larger sacred community to which we belong. To damage this community is to diminish our own existence. Berry calls for a re-enchanting of the cosmos and a deep felt kinship with the natural world that must pour forth in art, story, and celebration. Thus, as a final project for that class, my intention was to relate an experience that would not only describe this kind of relationship with the natural world, but that would also give the listener a visceral experience of this kind of relationship. My hope was that, by virtue of its telling, some glimmer of resonance might be kindled in listeners, who would then be inspired to befriend the earth in their own way. What I'm about to present here is that story I told, embedded in the larger account of what has transpired since its telling, a story within a story. A walk in the woods. Have you ever had the pleasure of really walking on the earth? What I mean to say is that, for the most part, floors and roads mediate our experience of the ground beneath us. Thomas Berry speaks about how we, quote, still respond emotionally when the natural world impinges on our consciousness, but also says that we have difficulty with this sense of mystery because we no longer understand the voices speaking to us from the surrounding world. If, as children, we become proficient in human language, we generally remain deaf to the multitude of languages of the natural world about us. This train of thought bubbled up on the heels of an adventure that reintroduced me to Earth in a profound way. I was in Oregon to climb the South Sister, a mountain in the Cascade Range. That's the South Sister, not Shasta. The weather could not have been more perfect. 4 days of glorious sunshine and clear blue skies. Because of record winter precipitation, massive swaths of snow still lay thick in places that would normally have been melted out, giving the landscape a gorgeous contour and providing a welcome reprieve from the summer heat. Like all the big peaks in the Cascade Range, the South Sister is volcanic, and the fir, hemlock, and pine forests that we hiked through while gaining elevation gave way to a moonscape of reddish-brown rocks that revealed their relatively recent history as molten lava. Without snowfields, the vista would be dry, near treeless in places, and weirdly forbidding. But the massive curves of white were not only gorgeous, they also whispered to instincts long buried that this land is safe. There is water. There is life. We made our base camp some 3,000 feet below the summit. Wind-sculpted white bark pines, gnarled from the conditions at high elevation, framed our view of Chambers Lake. Behind us loomed the peak, fierce, massive, imposing, yet achingly beautiful. Brilliant green grasses stretched out in places where the snow had already melted. Intrepid wildflowers pushed their way up through rocky soil in astonishing shocks of color. Wispy clouds gathered and then lazily dispersed about the summit. All told, it is impossible to articulate the raw gorgeousness that saturates such a scene. As I soaked myself in the liquid beauty, drank it in until it virtually spilled out through my eyes and fingertips and was exhaled in the vapors of my breath. And even then, I was not too full of it, for it was life itself pouring into my soul and restoring dry, depleted systems to lush, flowing balance. In the evening, we perched on comfortable rocks to watch the sun set and the full moon rise. And in the morning, we rose with the first light. My father, now 73, recounted an endless string of stories about exploring these hills in his youth. He was 15 when he first climbed the South Sister. Yet in those days, the area was not a designated wilderness. They hadn't built any trails yet. Yep, these hills were just wild. Nobody in them. We had to park way the hell and gone out and go cross country the whole way. Back in 1955, Jim Harang and I came in here from the southeast side. Man, that was a fantastic trip. Hiked up above the Green Lakes, about 6,400 feet elevation, then traversed the whole way across. He must have told us about hundreds of trips he took up, over, and around the neighboring mountains. He came to know the region intimately. In fact, he remembers every single excursion in a kind of detail that borders on the bizarre. From the event's exact date to who accompanied him to the tricky route they took, the snowpack levels and weather conditions and beyond. I listened to his tales, which bowled me over with the same passion and excitement he'd experienced when they were actually happening. I felt indescribably blessed and honored to be learning about the land in this way, through stories of the heart from an elder in my own family. He is not a religious person, nor even an overtly spiritual person, but it is clear to anyone who knows him that the mountains have been his divine source from the moment he set foot in them. Many of his theories about life and the way things are trace back to things he watched unfold in the wilderness, whether they were geologic formations, animal behavior, or the way water moves down a stream. He takes these things as a starting point and extrapolates from there about meaning, human nature, and culture, passing on to me something a bit like what Barry refers to as a cultural coding of the ecological age. It was not in camp that I had my remarkable experience, however, nor was it on the day that we hiked cross country to climb to the summit, as inspiring as that was. No, it wasn't until the fourth day that I was gifted this experience that quietly and unceremoniously shifted me into an altered reality. We had packed up camp and were hiking back down the flanks of the great volcano, meandering off trail and through Ponderosa Pine, when I suddenly sank into a state of, for lack of a better term, deep connectedness. We had been walking for a few hours without the use of map or compass. Of course, we had these things with us, but we hadn't bothered to get them out because of my father's intrinsic at-homeness in the region. It was enough to know that there were this many stream drainages to cross, and that we would be losing elevation at approximately this pace, and that when the tree species changed from pine to hemlock, we would have reached that point in the journey. Wandering along in the golden haze of the summer woods, the sun slanting down through the trees, I bent my leg to maneuver over a fallen pine tree and felt an immense contentedness sweep through me. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say, sweep over me. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say sweep through me, for as I looked down at my suntanned arm, reaching out for a branch that I was using to steady myself, all at once they both seemed like the same thing. That is to say, they felt equally like the things that function as arm or branch extensions for the surrounding landscape, of which I had become an integral part. I ceased to be a person in the wilderness and entered into the communion of subjects of which Thomas Berry speaks. In fact, it was something beyond the I-thou relationship, for I felt like a mobile extension of the earth, walking on itself. There was really no difference between the tree and me. We were equally valuable beings. It is a challenge to describe the felt sense of this and how it differs from walking in a setting or looking at a view. As Barry says, we are not accustomed to think of ourselves as integral with or subject to the universe, to the planet Earth, or to the community of living beings. But this shift in perspective was something like the difference between being a tourist visiting a national park, looking at it with maps as mediators, versus being one of the animals in the national park, a natural and fundamental part of it. Earth itself was inviting me to be both attentive and relational. My every movement was a part of a lively back and forth between body and land. Each step I took in the uneven and irregular terrain was an altogether novel and original experience. It felt like no one has been in this exact place, or moved in this particular way, or co-created this unique motion of body and branch together in the history of the universe. I am the cosmological story, effortlessly unfolding. All my senses became hyper-attuned as I entered into what can only be called a conversation with the landscape around me. The earth was expecting me to engage and asking me to participate, and I responded to this implicit encouragement, or rather, love, and felt it a natural conversation to have. The relationship was one of deep mutual respect and regard. I felt the millennia of evolutionary history alive and tingling in my flesh, and there was my father, through the trees, an image of our ancestors who needed neither map nor compass, but walked through the wilds like we do our backyards. The moment felt timeless, like expanding and breathing an inhalation that included the whole planet. The thing is, I have been off trail before. I've gone cross country to climb mountains, and it has been joyful and amazing. So what made this particular time different? What set it apart? The thing that I can point to is that all those other times I was using navigational tools, at the very least a map, to keep track of where I was, and the use of these tools kept me oriented, however subtly, not to reality, but to a human representation of reality. It created a slight degree of separation between me and the natural world, regardless of the fact that I was walking right through the heart of it. This time, I was completely unconcerned with locating myself near a line on a map. I was with my dad, and he knew how to talk to these woods. And he was teaching me how to talk to them. Generations of wisdom were being handed down to me from both my human and my non-human relations. My body and senses were functioning as they were meant to, in complete harmony with the other beings with whom they co-evolved. We were all there together, like friends at a community gathering, each of us moving parts of the earth, and all things were right with the world. Now, I'm not going to point out how this relates to Thomas Berry's impassioned pleas that we listen to our other than human voices. And it's probably not necessary to articulate my full agreement with his point that the earth is our primary teacher and that the natural world has rights. I would, however, like to thank Carbon, without whom all this would not be possible. But there is no grand moral to the story. It is simply a tale I wanted to tell of my love for the mountains and for my dad. Now go walk in the woods. So that's where the first story ends. That's what I plan to present. But it's where the second story begins. Because after reading this to the class last fall, it occurred to me that I should give it to my father as a Christmas gift. In fact, this was suggested to me. I further realized, rather reluctantly, that for some inchoate reason, I felt called to read this aloud to my entire family on Christmas Day. So, with a certain amount of trepidation and shyness, but knowing that there was no way around it, I presented this to my family. It had been about 30 years since I'd seen my father cry. And now the grandkids sat wide-eyed as they witnessed their grandpa listening to this story and openly weeping in front of them. Something profound was happening, but no one was quite sure what. In the days that followed, my father cracked open. He began to experience a whole new rash of emotions, and bouts of sobbing overtook him at any time of the day or night. He had recognized a deep truth in my story, something he knew but had not been able to articulate. And hearing it spoken aloud was the drop of water that caused the whole reservoir to flow over the dam. Other factors were involved in preparing the way for this transformational shift, not the least of which was his recent retirement from local politics. But my reading the story, and in a sense calling out and making explicit his own spiritual connection to the natural world, served as a catalyst. As I'm sure most of you know, sudden and profound shifts in consciousness can be extremely difficult to navigate. It is one thing when we consciously seek out these altered states, quite another when they are thrust upon us. Along with dawning emotions and beautiful epiphanies, there can also be tidal waves of fear and anxiety as long repressed memories and shadow material are suddenly unleashed. By New Year's Day, my father's spiritual emergency was in full effect. Not only was he swimming in newly emerged material from his own unconscious, he was also awash in grief for the earth and her failing systems. He had been a somewhat embittered environmental activist for decades, but what he'd heretofore been able to safely compartmentalize as rational scientific knowledge about the climate crisis and righteous anger at useless politicians, head stuff, was suddenly showing up as anguish to be felt and processed in his body. 73 years of split-off emotion and empathy for the natural world, not just as home, but as relation, as source, were clamoring to be felt all at once. It is a lot easier and more acceptable to keep one's messy feelings channeled into pessimism, rational action, and political discussion. But as he began to recognize the depths of his spiritual connection to the soul of the natural world, it suddenly became clear that witnessing it being destroyed was akin to watching his family suffer. Profound grief, profound frustration and helplessness. His pessimism had been in direct proportion to the profundity of his love for the natural world. It had been a strong, solid defense against despair and had enabled him to keep things up top in his razor-sharp mind rather than farther down in his soft defenseless body where it would have to be felt as emotion. With his ego defenses collapsed and open, he was therefore shocked and totally befuddled to find himself replacing the atheism that he had inherited from his father with this new sense of conscious spiritual connection, which is great, but tremendously disorienting when it comes after 73 years of thinking otherwise. By early February, the intensity of his shift had increased to extreme insomnia, night terrors, and despairing thoughts of suicide. The crushing sadness on behalf of the earth and his inability to see a way forward through the crisis, both personal and planetary, was almost too much to bear. I'm sure many of us in this room have been in the exact same position, or some variation of it. Isn't that why most of us are here? Because we woke up one day and realized that the dominant paradigm preaches total insanity and that we had to be a part of birthing something new? When this kind of shift happens, it is essential that we witness, hold, and recognize it as a sacred deepening into soul. James Hillman and Bill Plotkin both speak to this, and as I flew home in February to get my father out of the hospital, I marveled at how I had the wisdom of an entire community of healers and philosophers at my fingertips. I was taking Rick's course on Hillman at the time, and no sooner would I read a page than it would become immediately and practically applicable. Everything in the PCC canon, from Teilhard and Barry to Tarnas and Swim, Macy and Groff, sprang off the pages and became essential timbers in framing this crisis with my dad. He spent 5 days in the psychiatric unit of a hospital because that's what our culture has to offer in terms of safe containers. A few hundred years ago, when an individual found himself unable to endure this kind of event by himself, it might have been brought to the larger space of the tribe to be held, shared, and together metabolized into the collective psyche, or noosphere. Something like what Joanna Macy does with her work that reconnects. The modern industrial society, however, has hospitals and suppressive drugs. And while these things can be useful, they are not conducive to an appreciation of the sacred nature of these kinds of transitions. My dad needed to know that what he was going through was ultimately healing and evolutionary, even though it felt terrifying and destabilizing. He needed to know that he was supported and understood by other humans who share a similar cosmology, one underpinned by love and a profound connectedness to the natural world. Am I done? Okay, cool. So in a very real way, and this is where you come in, I felt like I was bringing with me to Washington this entire community, internalized and compacted down to my physical body like a mobile triage unit. So in the ensuing weeks, I've been relying on the vision and support of my tribe in the Bay Area. I've been sending copies of Brian Swim's Journey of the Universe, Joanna Macy's Coming Back to Life. I frequently forward conversations from PCC chat and links to the PCC forum presentations. I read to him from Thomas Berry when he calls at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, and he's reassured. So I want to thank all of you for helping to create a world that makes sense, for co-creating an environment that is prepared to receive these awakening souls. This is the power of a cosmology of love. What we have here indicates a deeper wisdom at work and points to the collective nature of this planetary shift and how the crises or breakdowns of individuals are not isolated events, but in fact, micro markers of this larger process. I'm just going to read, in closing, I want to leave you with a sense of your own vital preciousness. Never underestimate the import, as Robert said yesterday, of subtle activism and the living power of true ideas, especially those infused with love. Keep speaking your truth. What you bring forth can elicit in another a deep and resonant sense of, yes, this is true, and become the first thread from which a new community can be woven. It can create a safe space of sanity for someone. I got this short note from him in response to an essay that I sent on Teilhard. Clara, the minute we got home, I read your piece on Teilhard. I found it quite profound. It was interesting that you mentioned laying down flat on the grass in the backyard in order to feel an earth contact. Many times when I was working in the garden, I had no shoes on because it felt so good to be in direct contact with the dirt and leaves, sort of like I was a plant growing too. I can't tell you how many times I felt a contented bliss as I sat or lay in the backyard in the sun with the breeze, everything growing, humming. I absolutely did not want to be anywhere else. It is definitely necessary to feel a great connection to the whole of the universe, especially to our planet. We're all in it together. As you said, each of us is stardust. It seems there is an awakening to that now, hopefully. I believe you and your community will be leading in that direction. Love, Dad.
What is your dad's name?
John.
John. Hopefully John will be seeing this at some point.
Yes.
Can just collectively, I'm sure everybody would love to just say, hi John, we love you.
Hopefully they'll be down in the fall and taking a class at CIS, sitting in a class.
Thank you.